You know, this time of year, January, heart of winter, we all start missing the sun, the warm weather, the longer days. In fact, there's seasonal depression that I guess is a real thing. I just call it winter blues. But most of us, you know, this time of the year, it can get to the place where we're just, man, I just feel like I've lost the zest. I miss being able to take my grandkids to the park. And we're past the excitement of Christmas. There was that, you know, when the big winter starts. You got the family gatherings with Thanksgiving and then Christmas. But now we get to this place, it's mid-January. Spring is so long away, and the warm weather is even further away. Am I depressing you further? It's usually why I try to plan something to look forward to this time of year. Right? And I usually try to get something at least. And all the while our kids were growing up, we would do this. We would try to have something that the kids could look forward to. And that's why God, I believe, put feasts in Israel's calendar. They had feasts throughout the calendar that they were required to celebrate. I mean, you got to love a God who requires his people to party. That's what it was. It was a requirement to stop working and to celebrate for a while. And then a big thing for the Israelites were weddings. Weddings were a big deal, and everybody looked forward to getting to the weddings. Well, for some of you, life in general feels like winter. Not just the weather outside, but work isn't what it used to be. You were so excited when you started that job. Not anymore. School, same way. You got into that college. Yeah, the excitement is worn off with all of those papers that are due and the midterms and all of that. Some of you have been analyzing your own friendships, and you've been asking yourself, man, who do I have that are close friends? Do I ever spend any time with any of my friends? And some of your marriages are that way. It feels like it's winter in your marriage. I mean, the day you stood at that altar and those plans that you were making and that honeymoon and the first year and all the excitement of being together and the newness, that's long gone. Now it just feels like your roommates. Just no excitement anymore. You love your kids. Of course you love your kids. But it's not quite like when you brought them home from the hospital, right? Because now they're starting to get on your nerves, and they're annoying, and they're fighting with each other. And maybe it's even winter when it comes to family life. Now, what if there was a family wedding in the next couple of weeks to look forward to? Loved ones that you'd see from out of town, a reception and a dance and all the fun that goes along with it. That's something to look forward to. Well, in Israel, however, the weddings were a much bigger affair. It wasn't just a Saturday or a weekday and an evening reception. It took all week. The festivities lasted an entire week. A week-long celebration, extended family and out-of-town friends would all gather together, and they would hang out the entire week. They'd have great food that was provided for them. There'd be hors d'oeuvres every evening and wine and just small talk, but there was also dancing every evening. Now, that's something to look forward to. That'd be a week that we'd have to look forward to. And what I love is Jesus enjoyed these celebrations as well. But in the middle of this celebration, and most of you know the story, in the middle of this celebration, there's a major debacle, and Jesus comes to the rescue. So we're going to look at John chapter 2, and I want you to get your Bibles out. Let's look at this ourselves in our Bibles, and if you don't have a Bible of your own on your electronic device, on your phone, or we've got them in those blue hardcover Bibles. If you're using one of those blue hardcover Bibles, it's page 887 in those Bibles. So let's take a look at this together. We're going to look at the first 11 verses of John chapter 2. And as we begin, let's pray. Father, this is your word. We believe it is true, and we receive what it says. In the name of Jesus, open our hearts and engage our minds. Amen. All right, so we're here in John chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. We read this. It says, on the third day, there was a wedding at Canaan in Galilee. So when it starts off with on the third day, what's he talking about? It almost sounds like on the third day when Jesus rose again, right? In fact, some commentators have speculated that this was going to be a theme. It's like his opening miracle and his closing miracle was his resurrection. I think they're reading too much into it. I think John is just offering, because he's writing what really happened, he's just offering some information that isn't necessary to the plot, but it does remind us that what he was writing was really true. This isn't something that was made up long after the fact. It was something that was written about at the time. The third day, it could be referring to either the third day after the incident that took place right above this. If you look at the end of chapter 1, when he called his initial disciples, not all of them yet. He'd only called a couple of them at this point. But he called those initial disciples. So it may have been the interaction he had with Nathanael, may have been the third day after that. Some have speculated, well, this could be the third day of the wedding when Jesus actually showed up. I don't think that's the case. I actually think it's the third day of the week, because what John was doing, he was describing this week when Jesus was in Galilee. Right before this, he was in Capernaum on the north end of the Sea of Galilee. And now the third day of that week, then he goes to this wedding. He and his disciples go to this wedding. So it says there was a wedding. And as I've already mentioned, the wedding for them was a much bigger ordeal. It's something that he would have looked forward to seeing people that he grew up with. There would have been peers there. There would have been family members, extended family members. And so this would have been something that he was looking forward to going to himself, a much bigger deal, or a deal that would take a week. And it says that this wedding was at Canaan in Galilee. Now, actually, I've been to Canaan. 5 years ago, in one of our bridge trips to Israel, we went to Canaan, actually did some, not really weddings, but we did our vows. In fact, those that were married, that were there as married couples, we stood. And Junior is actually reading this very same story from his Bible there in Canaan. And then right after this, we all lined up, and those of us, Junior was able to do it because his wife wasn't on this trip, so he officiated. That's strange to have your own son officiate over your wedding. But he officiated over our retelling of our vows, which was a cool thing. But that was actually in Canaan. Canaan was located not far from where Jesus grew up. We believe that this is the spot right here. There's a couple of other possible places, but all right in the same area where this one's located. And this location is 8 miles north of Nazareth. So in the northern part of Israel, Nazareth, of course, is where Jesus grew up. So it'd be natural that he would be going to Cana for a wedding because, again, these would have been some people that he would have been familiar with. His dad, his stepdad was a tradesman, and Jesus would have learned that trade early on in life, and they all would have traveled to Sephora to do their work where most of the construction was going on at the time. And so there was a lot of these other tradesmen that he would have known from the area, that he would have gone to the synagogue school with, and so it's a natural place for him to have gone. Now, it says that Mary was also there, and Jesus was also invited. And again, probably lots of extended family, peers. But the point here that I find interesting is that not only was Jesus invited, but that he went. He was just starting his ministry, an important time. He's only got 3 years to do ministry now. And this is an important time and the beginning of a very busy time, but it was important to him to go. Jesus was not ascetic. He loved parties. And I think that this kind of thing, this celebration and this attitude of getting together and interacting and enjoying one another and celebrating, this is important for life. It's something that God has built within us to desire, and we get a lot of enjoyment from it. And in fact, I think one of the most damaging aspects of this pandemic that we've all been through was that we've had to lack a lot of that. And we see some of the psychological damage that has played out because of it. And all the while our kids were growing up, and even today, I have it built in our calendar that Linda and I have something that we're planning in the next couple of months, something to look forward to, where we're getting together, where there'll be an atmosphere of enjoyment, people that we haven't seen in a while. We continue on verse 3. It says, when the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. Well, of course, this seems like just a very simple little thing. It's the kind of thing that my wife would say to me if we were at a wedding reception, they ran out of wine, and Linda would say, oh, they ran out of wine. And I would have just taken it as, okay, yeah, no big deal. We have nothing to do with that. But that's not what Mary was doing. She wasn't just saying, we can tell this by Jesus' response. This wasn't just small talk. Instead, she went to Jesus and said, they ran out of wine. And Jesus understood that she was expecting him to do something about this. Now, why does the fact that they ran out of wine, why does that even matter? It doesn't seem like it would matter a whole lot. I mean, some of you might say, good, shouldn't have any alcohol there anyway. Well, wrong. This instead was a disaster for the groom especially, but his whole family. because it was expected. In fact, we have documents from that era, writings from rabbis that gave a legal liability to the groom and his family for providing for guests coming to the wine, both food as well as wine. Now, not that if these were close friends and family members that anybody would have sued them for running out of wine, but this was a honor-shame-based society. And the shame that was involved in not being properly prepared and to run out of something that was so important to a wedding. And it was huge. The wine was a huge deal to them for a celebration such as this. We do know that for the Old Testament Jews, and I think it extended all the way through into the New Testament era as well, that the symbolism of wine was very important. It symbolized joy and happiness. In fact, we have a saying by the Jewish rabbis that they said, without wine there is no joy. Because wine symbolized joy to them. And we have some scriptures in the Old Testament. I'll just give you a couple where Psalm 104:15 says, he, meaning God, that God makes wine that gladdens human hearts. Or we have Ecclesiastes 9:7, where Solomon, we believe, wrote this, so go ahead. Eat your food with joy and drink your wine with a happy heart, for God approves of this. So it's interesting then, this major catastrophe that takes place when they run out of wine early in the week. It brings shame upon the groom. As people are talking about this, you know they are. They're saying, how is he going to provide for his wife when he can't even provide for a week-long gathering like this? Somebody messed up where they didn't plan ahead properly. So it's interesting that Mary went to Jesus with this problem. Because it's not like she thought he had some kind of a miracle up his sleeve, because he hadn't performed any miracles up until then. This, we find when we get to the end of this story, that this is the first of his miracles. But yet she went to him seemingly expecting him to do something about this. Maybe it's because he was her oldest son. And maybe she thought he was going to go travel and get the wine, or we're not sure. But she seemed to be, and in fact, by Jesus' reaction, it seems as though she understood that this could be a breakout moment for him to exhibit who he was. And so Mary went to Jesus, and I'm glad that she did go to him, because it tells me something. You know, what do you do when the wine runs out? Because again, for some of you right now, it feels that way. With your job, with your marriage, the lack of friendships. I've had people say to me, man, I just need a hobby. All I do is watch TV. I need something to do. So what did you do when it feels as though the wine is gone from your life? And Mary went to Jesus, and she says, they have no wine. And we look at verse 4. Verse 4, and Jesus said to her, woman. Oh, wait, woman? Isn't that a little disrespectful? You know, if I were to greet you out in the hallway and I say, hey, woman, you know, my wife would slap me if I did that. And honestly, I have referred to my wife at times. You know, I've said to her, hey, woman, but I'm joking. And I've even learned not to do that while joking. So why does Jesus say this? Doesn't that sound rude? Well, it wasn't rude. And in that culture, it wasn't. It was actually a way to speak with love, believe it or not. And it may not seem to sound that way right off when we just read it, but think of it this way, the medieval term, my lady. That was actually an honoring way to address a woman, to say, my lady. But you think about the actual words to say, my lady. She's your lady. You're calling her your lady. I mean, that's offensive. Well, Jesus wasn't being offensive at all, because we know that when he was on the cross and dying and caring for his dear mother, he looks at Mary and he says, woman, same way he addressed her now, woman, behold your son. So this wasn't rude at all. He was simply, it was actually, you think of it in terms of, if you want to say my lady or my dear mother or dear woman. We continue on in verse 4. He says, my lady, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. What does this have to do with me? It's the actual original wording. In fact, if you're familiar with some of the older versions, it says, what does that have to do with you and me? Jesus was saying is, why is this our responsibility? What does this have to do with us? And he knew that she was expecting him to do something big, because then he says, my hour has not yet come. Now that terminology, hour, John uses this 4 more times in the Gospels until the 5th time. But the next 4 times he uses this in his Gospels, it says that Jesus' hour had not yet come. But then we get into John 17, and Jesus is praying in the garden when he says, Father, the hour has come. That is the hour when his work that he came here to accomplish, his death on the cross on our behalf so that we could be forgiven, in his resurrection, that it was not yet time for him to be revealed in this way. That's what he was saying. So he, in a sense, he is saying, this isn't the time. And yet, even though he seems to say, I don't want to do anything about this problem that you say we have, he does. He winds up working a miracle after seeming to tell her that he didn't want to. So why? Well, because she's his mother. And I don't know, my wife, she can get our kids to do stuff that I wouldn't even ask. For example, this was just last spring, we knew our staff here at the Bridge, it had been a long year. We all know what 2020 was like for all of us. It was that way for all of us. And it was particularly discouraging for staff having responsibility for ministries we couldn't really get going yet. And so we just knew that we needed a time away. And we had a lot of time where they weren't even in the office. We needed a time away together where we could gel. And so we took the whole staff up to Camp Awana, our camp, and did just a wonderful day away. And Junior had put together this treasure hunt game where and this is the whole staff right here at camp. And it was a fantastic day to fulfill the purpose. What Junior did, the way we got started, because a lot of our staff hadn't even been to camp and didn't know their way around camp, and a good way to find out about camp was to do a treasure hunt over all of the camp. We all got on golf carts and teams, and he had these clues. He and Jordan actually did this together. They had clues hidden all over camp that they had to find, and all the clues, they were rhyming and they were a bit clever. For example, this is one of them he did. It's been years since I've been considered new, but recently I just carried dudes of 2. So if you're familiar with the podcast that Junior and Jordan do, and if you're not, you ought to. I know he's my son, and I wouldn't listen to it for a long time, but once I did, I thought, man, there's nothing on there like this. It's actually awesome. But if you're familiar with 2 dudes in a canoe, you know that this was a canoe. So I came home talking about how this was really cool with the game that we played. Well, Linda had just been asked by her boss to put something together for their team at work at United Airlines. And so that would gel the staff and get them together. And so she said, I'm going to do that. So what does she do to do it? Instead of coming up with all of her own ideas, she calls Junior and asks him to do it for her, or to come up with all of the, I wouldn't even ask him to do it. And he even told me later, I had all these deadlines and I didn't have time. I said, well, why'd you do it? Well, because Mom asked. Yeah, because when Mom asks, things get done. And Mary was Jesus' mother, so he does it. Verse 5, look at verse 5. It says, his mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. And I don't know if Jesus overheard that or not. I'm not sure. But she walked away with this idea that he says he's not going to do it, but I think he's going to, because I am his mom, and I gave birth to this young man. In verse 6 and 7, if you look at verses 6 and 7, it says, now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of public purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. And Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water, and they filled them up to the brim. So what we have going on here is the law of Moses required that they do ceremonial washing. And the tradition that followed with that was that they would have stone pots of water and also a water basin at the door when people came in to have their feet washed. But these were giant water pots that were used actually to fill up mikvahs. So there was a lot of water. This stood for, actually, these pots stood for the law as well as tradition. Jesus did what the law and tradition could not do. The law and tradition could provide cleansing from the dirt that was on the body, but Jesus gave an inner cleansing of the soul. And so we find there are 6 jars that these servants have access to. And each of these jars, these 6 jars, is 20 that would hold 20 to 30 gallons, depending on the size that they have. Well, that's a total of between 120 and 180 gallons. So you think about this miracle, that means Jesus turned water into wine, all of us into wine. That's over 900 bottles of wine. I mean, isn't that overkill? Isn't that too much? But what we don't get is this. Everybody there at the wedding celebration, they would have gotten this. We wouldn't have. But Jesus was attacking and declaring victory over a very well-known false Greek mythical god of that day. See, Greek mythology was huge. And even though it wasn't accepted by the Jews, it was accepted by everybody that lived around them and among them. And just right nearby, there was this city of Sephora, which we were there in Sephora. Sephora was just a few miles away from Nazareth. It's a town I mentioned earlier where Jesus no doubt would have gone with his stepfather to do carpentry work. It was actually, the word for carpenter is actually stonemason. And this was a very Roman city. It was filled with all of the Greek idols and the Greek deities. They were all over the place. All of the schools taught this, the Greek mythology and the deities surrounding this. And this was a big deal. And so they would declare Zeus is the king. And others would say, yeah, but Poseidon, he rules the seas. Or I want to be Apollo with his archery. And each person had their own Greek god that they identified with. And each god had their own backstory of how they overcame something, how they became divine, and what they were good at. And while it wasn't that way with most Jews, unless they had become Romanized themselves, but this was people's obsession. And their cities like Sephora were filled with statues and temples to these deities, and their homes were adorned with their personal god or goddesses. And the Jews in the area were very well aware of those false deities and the stories behind them. And one of these gods, and maybe you've heard his name before, his name was Dionysius. And Dionysius, he was the kind of the young, cool, trendy, hip god. He was the youngest of all the gods on Mount Olympus. And Dionysius' father was Zeus, the king god. So Dionysius was the son of the main god. And not only that, there's a story that Dionysius was killed at one point by an enemy and torn to shreds. And Zeus then recreated him. And it goes even further than this. Dionysius, being young, was the party god, the god for all of their celebrations. And they'd highlight him at celebrations because he supposedly brought life and fun to the party. But here Jesus comes along and shatters the image of Dionysius. Jesus was and is the son of the one true God. And he does not just bring fun to the party. He is the party. And maybe you don't like to hear that. But you think about how many stories about Jesus and stories that Jesus tells that involve some kind of a major celebration. In fact, you look at how Jesus describes heaven in his own teaching as a giant banquet celebration, one big joy-filled party with God at the center and Jesus in the middle with him. And here at this party, here they've run out of wine. They've run out of what they viewed as joy, what symbolized joy. And Jesus overwhelms them with far more than what they need. And I guess you could say that he caused their cups to overflow with 900 bottles of joy, 900 bottles of wine. And see how long it takes you to sing that song. Then we have verse 8. And he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. The servants did this. Now, by the way, this points out that this was a pretty big celebration, even though it was in small Canaan, because there was a master of the feast, meaning that there was somebody that was actually hired to take care of details. And so he says, draw the water out, fill these water pots with water, and draw the water out. Why would they do this? Only because Mary must have had some kind of clout, because Mary told them to do whatever he says, and so these servants do it, but it doesn't make sense. To them, why are they doing? Now they're taking water out of these containers that are used to wash people's feet, and now we're supposed to take this to the master of the feast? We would never give this away as drinking water. There's a lot of things that Jesus asks us to do that does not make sense. You have a special girlfriend who really turns you on. Man, it doesn't make sense to not sleep with her until you're married. You have a boss who is impossible to work for. It doesn't make sense to show him respect and honor no matter how he treats you. You have a deadbeat husband who doesn't show you any love. It doesn't make sense to still be loving and caring and have a submissive heart and attitude towards him. Doesn't make sense. And oftentimes when Jesus asks us to do something specific and it doesn't make sense, And by the way, it's almost always against what we want to do. If we do what Jesus says anyway, it's the beginning of some fantastic things. We continue on verses 9 and 10. It says, when the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, so he didn't even know that this came out of those water pots, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine, but you have kept the good wine until now. Well, that was the custom. You give them the good wine first, because on the first taste, that's when you notice it. And he's not saying that once they are drunk, they won't even notice if it's not good wine. He's simply saying it's the first taste that you pay attention to, and after that, you're not going to notice it as much. And so Jesus turns it around and gave them better wine than even the wine they had run out of. Now, some of you might have trouble with Jesus turning water into any kind of alcoholic beverage. And I became a believer in a Baptist church. I went to a Baptist Bible college, and if you're familiar with Baptist teaching, they're death on any kind of alcohol. I was a teetotaler for many years, not because I believed that it was wrong. I just stayed away from it because I just had never drank being in those circles. And but there's no doubt, and there is no doubt that there's serious danger in alcohol. I mean, addiction, poor judgment that people have when they're drinking. For some, alcohol itself becomes an idol. It's like, yeah, beer, yeah, wine. Or you see them posting, oh, now I can be happy because I've got wine. And it can become almost like an idol. And drunkenness, by the way, is always a sin. And no follower of Jesus ought ever to drink alcohol to the place where their senses are in the least diminished, even feeling a buzz. But to condemn something carte blanche that Jesus obviously endorsed puts us in dangerous territory. Jesus did turn water into wine. But why? Why did he do this? Simply because he cares. God cares. And your finances may be a big stressor right now. I can tell you that God cares. And I know that doesn't put money in your bank account, but it does change things. He cares about your situation and the stress you feel. Your marriage, maybe it's a drag, no romance, you're not on the same page. God cares about that. And yes, he's the God of the universe, and he's worshiped by armies of angels, but his eye is on the sparrow. How much more does he care for you? Your job security, your depression, your anxiety, your child, your health, your loneliness, he cares. And I know it doesn't automatically fix what you're going through. I know this truth isn't money in your account, a job offer, or a new romance. But you need to know this. He cares. And for example, when my kids were little and they would go through some kind of a struggle, and I remember sometimes I would just shake my head and smile. It was such a silly little thing. And I wanted to say to them, tomorrow you won't even remember this happening, or as they got older, a week from now, it'll be a different boy or a different girl, or, I wanted to let them see in the big picture of things, none of this matters, but that wouldn't help. And I'm sure there's times that God would like to say, listen, in the backdrop of eternity, this issue that you think is such a big deal and such a stressor, there's really nothing to it, but he doesn't say that. He cares. He cares about the little things in that child's life. And he cares about those things in your life. He cared about a groom who felt shame because he ran out of wine. So what do you do when the joy runs out? Well, we learned some great principles, and I want to just give you these principles. 3 of them. First of all, doing what Jesus says matters. I love what Mary says. Do what he says to the servants. Because what Jesus says to do matters. And these servants were complaining, I'm sure, we need wine, not ritual water. Who invited this rabbi? Why are we listening to him? But it made all the difference. And what Jesus says to do can be the difference between joy and misery. I bet you can look back on your life and attest to this. That season of life, it was so good. I was doing what Jesus told me to do. I was doing well. And now that season, not so much. So to take this to a deeper level, Anytime we run out of joy in our life, marriage is dragging, job is difficult, finances are stressful. When that happens, as followers of Jesus, we have to at least stop and ask ourselves, am I doing what Jesus says? Have I run out of joy partly because of me? Maybe at least a little bit? And so then even right now, in the middle of this difficulty, am I doing my part to do what Jesus says? This wedding, the wine was gone because of poor planning. I mean, they didn't buy enough, or they invited too many people, but it was poor planning. And Jesus could have said, hey, listen, a mistake, poor planning on your part doesn't constitute an emergency on my part. He could have said that, and the truth is that it was a mistake on their part. And we have to ask ourselves sometimes, okay, is some of this on me? In the same way we find ourselves out of wine, there's often something that we've done that contributed. Now, not always, but often. The marriage might be a drag because you're not connecting. No date nights, no connection, not having fun together. Of course your marriage is out of wine. That's like the guy who complained to me a while back. He said, my wife never wants to have sex. It's rarely, ever, all her fault. And I asked her, I said, are you someone that she would want to have sex with? He goes, what do you mean? I'm her husband. Yeah, that doesn't matter. Sex starts in the kitchen. I mean, not literally, though, I mean, it can, but it starts with serving her, making her dinner, doing the dishes, loving her, listening to her. And lead, man. You're not attractive if you don't take initiative in your family and lead. Instead, you follow her around like a puppy dog, and that's not sexy. Lead, be a man. And that's what Jesus tells us to do. Lay our life down for her, sacrifice for her. That's how you get the wine in marriage. Anytime we run out of wine in our life, we have to ask ourselves, am I contributing to this? Job is a drag. Am I contributing to it? Am I always complaining about it at work or at home to my family? Am I not trying to make it a fun experience? Am I difficult myself to work with? Am I showing respect even to those I don't think deserve it? Hey, do what Jesus says. Kids are exhausting me. Well, kids will be exhausting. But also, am I contributing? Am I disciplining? Am I taking needed date nights with my spouse to get a breather? Am I setting boundaries? Anytime we run out of joy, we need to step back and ask ourselves, am I doing what Mary said, doing what he says? Sometimes the lack of wine is not our fault, but more often we do contribute, and it should make us recalibrate our lives to do what Jesus says. Number 2. Servants have the most fun. If you look at the text, who got the front row tickets to Jesus' first miracle? It wasn't the master of ceremonies. It was not the groom. It wasn't the bride. It wasn't even the disciples. It was the servants. God gives front row tickets to servants. We see it here in the text, but we see it all around us. The happiest people in our church are the servants. Many of you know Becky Hart. Becky is my assistant. She's also direct connections down at our north side location in the city. And Becky just had a major birthday. I better not tell you which one because I don't have permission to do that, but she just had a major birthday. So my wife and I sent her a flower cake. It's really cool. It looks like a cake, but it's flowers. And I found out that she wasn't even at home. She was at camp volunteering on this major birthday. Because if you know Paul and Becky at all, you know they are the picture of service. They love to serve. And they have been able to, over the years, see God do some, you know how we got that video that you saw earlier? That was through Paul and Becky and their influence on his life. And they get to witness this. So how is it that I drop my grandkids off in Bridge Kids and the teacher has got this great big smile on her face or his face? I mean, you're hanging all night with a bunch of kids. How are you smiling? Or I stop in at MSM and these middle school workers are having a blast. I mean, do you know what it's like working with middle schoolers? I mean, sorry, middle schoolers, but you know what I'm talking about because you get frustrated with your squirrely peers as well. But how about Bridge Kids teachers, HSM and MSM workers, Awana workers, all having so much fun? And some say it's their favorite part of the week. How can that be? Because they got to see God at work in these kids' little minds. And they get to see the faith of children and teenagers. I mean, there's more excitement in high school worship at Camp Awana than ever in our main auditorium. You come by on Saturdays to our food pantry. Scores of volunteers giving up a Saturday morning to carry boxes and set tables up. They're grinning from ear to ear. How? Because they get to be a part of the work of God, seeing God provide food each Saturday, and they get to have a front row seat to giving it to all the people that he brought into our doors. Servants have the most fun. You can't convince me otherwise. When joy runs out in life, sometimes the answer is do something for someone else. Get active in serving. Serve in God's kingdom work. If marriage is a drag, serve your spouse. Outdo your spouse in serving them. My wife and I, we have this little competition to see who can be the first one to get the other one their breakfast or their tea. We try to outdo each other that way, and that can be a blast doing that. Work at outdoing your spouse in serving. Things are tough at work. Job is a drag. Serve more. Fill the coffee pot. Bring in breakfast. Do those things that nobody else wants to do. The wine will come. You get a front row ticket to God doing something special. Sign up to serve at church. Get involved in Bridge Kids. Work with our students. Help with the food pantry. And by the way, we need more men, especially when it comes to working with the kids. Servants have the most fun. Servants get a front row seat. Third principle, when you run out of wine, do what Jesus says. Serve. And third principle is this. Jesus is the best party. And that's Jesus' most explicit message in this. I am shattering Dionysius. I'm bringing the party. But how many of us? We go to someone or something else for our wine. We're trying to get wine from our career or from our image. Trying to get wine from the way people look at us. That's where our joy or satisfaction comes from, shaping what people think of us. As long as my image is good and I look good, I'm happy. But if I got a bad hair day, low on wine. We get our wine from our bank account. We get our wine from relationships. Just going from relationship to relationship. And as soon as the wine runs out, on to the next relationship. We get our wine from eating, from websites, from substances, or from actual wine. We don't go to Dionysius, but we have our own idols, our own activities, our own people that we go to for fulfillment. And Jesus says right here, I want to shatter that for you because those other things will never actually provide you with what you're looking for. When are you going to stop looking for it in other places? I learned this many years ago when I first became a believer, and I had tried everything to try to find something worthwhile living for, and tried partying and sports and friends and everything I possibly could. Never found that fulfillment or that joy. I never had any happiness. And then I met a bunch of Christians. And interestingly, mostly high school age Christians. These guys were more fun to be around than anybody I had ever hung out with before. And they didn't drink, they didn't smoke pot, they didn't swear. Totally different from these other kids I used to hang out with. And yet they were a blast. Jesus was the center of their life. It reminds me, North Korea, there's a casino. And in this casino, people come and do what you do at casinos. They gamble, hoping to walk away with more wine than they came in with. But this specific casino is interesting because it's never, ever, ever, ever awarded a jackpot. In fact, they've even said they will give out no jackpots. They've openly said this. It sounds ridiculous, right? People are still going there day after day after day, hopeful to get something that is not ever going to be given. Yeah, it's ridiculous. But how many of us are there right now? Pulling that lever. Career. It's never provided the satisfaction that you're looking for, but just maybe this time. that relationship. Oh, maybe this time. That next project or promotion, maybe this time. Your image has never given you what you're hoping for, but maybe, just maybe, it will all come together one day and it'll give me joy. We find ourselves in the casino of life, pulling levers of relationships and friendships and image and jobs. Yet at the end of the week, we find ourselves still wanting, unsatisfied. Well, Jesus offers an overwhelming amount of the kind of joy that can never be taken away by outside circumstances. Do what he says. Be a servant and look to him for your wine. Which leads us to so what? Here's our question. In your life, where's the wine running out? Is it in your family, marriage, work? Or is it just life in general? And what are you going to do about it? Father, I thank you for your goodness to us. And as we think through this very first miracle that Jesus performed, that the statement of what he offers to us, what all of humanity longs for, I pray that because we understand the source of it, the one who created the world in the first place, he can create the grapes and turn it into wine. That's not a problem for him. And he wants to do that in our lives. I pray for those who come in today just feeling blah about life, and maybe they're new to church altogether because they're thinking, I got to try something. I pray that here, right now, on this evening, they come to understand that you are the source of what they are looking for. I pray that they would come to know you in that personal way, having your life within them. Maybe look to you for that fulfillment and satisfaction and joy. In Jesus' name, amen.